Again, everyone, thanks for coming on and wanting to chat all things cross triathlon. Like Tim was saying, I had a pretty successful professional career in racing off-road triathlon. I was kind of at the tail end of the heyday era of good sponsorship, good prize money, and a series that was in the kind of Pan American realm. And yeah, a lot of things fell into place for me. I also was training with the national team for Canada, trying to make the Olympics, more so on the relay to be like an domestique role. But ultimately, I had some issues that came up that took me from short list to long list. And which Tim alluded to was that I ended up having open heart surgery. Um, Ultimately, as a professional athlete, you get followed medically to clear that you are safe to compete. And so, anyone sitting on this call, if you can convince your general practitioner to get you an echocardiogram, I think it's always a big check mark because a lot of people would, say like, well, I found out in 2019 that I had something that 4 years later I would end up having open heart surgery for. Without that echo, I don't know that information, and you can become a nasty statistic of that really fit person that goes out for a run and doesn't come home. Um, so yeah, that's kind of one part of it. Um, and I have this pretty great career, find out this information, kept racing. And ultimately in that time, I was as well really kind of developed the coaching company that I run today, which is Mad Endurance. Myself as kind of the lead coach. And I've got as well Kirsten Sweetland as a coach as well in our fold. So have a pretty good coaching situation going, and yeah, with as things kind of developed, I kind of kept racing, and then there came a time where COVID happened, and we all kind of reevaluated what was going on and stuff. And I made a big decision to travel the world less, be at home more, which at the time was Whistler, BC. And I kind of wanted to make a bit of a shift into more just bike racing and whatnot. And that's kind of what I did, but which, led into, I kept getting these checks for my heart. And in 2023 in December, I had an echocardiogram that basically said this valve that I was born with was starting to have a regurg level that was increasing. It went from mild to basically severe. And at that time I was sat down and told that, your left ventricle is dilating and you're in the very early stages of having heart failure, which at the time, sitting there with no symptoms, actually feeling pretty good about my fitness, which was kind of funny when they were like, "Oh, how are you feeling?" And I was all dumbly like, "Yeah, I feel great," because I did at the time. To then find out like 20 minutes later that they're suggesting open heart surgery was a bit of a rude awakening, if you will. So it was like, I mean, last year was a terrible summer for me. I terrible in some ways, great in other ways. I had to do a ton of research, found a great surgeon in London, Ontario. And ultimately that's where I got my surgery. And I got my valve repaired versus replaced, which is pretty rare. And I owe a lot of thanks to a very talented surgeon for that one. And so, with all that being said, I'm in the recovery process. I'm about March 18th. I'll be 5 months post surgery. So I'm doing pretty good, exercising as tolerated, a lot more. But my training regime right now looks very different to what it has in past. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell in the last little while. You know, I was fortunate to get to see a lot of different Xterras, and that's something that we'll get to as we go through this Zoom. If there's a race that you've got bucket listed and you wanted to know a little bit about it, I've done an Xterra in almost every major hemisphere that they operate, so I probably know something about it or know someone who did it, or had an athlete that I sent to race that one and stuff. So my experience with cross triathlon, I would say it's a fairly deep understanding and knowledge. And again, as a question comes up into your head, like we will have a Q&A maybe at the end of course as well. But if something that I say sparks something, just throw it in the chat and I'll do my best to see it and kind of answer it. Or if you want me to elaborate on something, just kind of let me know. Because we want this to be, I think, productive for everyone, and useful for everyone. So, what is cross triathlon? There may be someone sitting on this call that is not totally sure, but basically it's like triathlon where you swim. The swim is very similar to what you'd see in any triathlon. Mountain bike, with, a flat bar. It's not a gravel bike. There's some rules associated with that. But it's mountain bike generally on, a mix of single track, double track. Really depends on the part of the world that you are in terms of the technical aspects of it. For some of the courses in Victoria and BC, you get a very challenging single track. For some of the other courses internationally, you don't get as much like thought out single track, but you get these like crazy hard technical sections because you're riding on cowpath, and that's the single track. It's like game trail almost. That was like, when I raced in Brazil, it was, you're on the run course and you have to wear gloves on your hands because you slide down a waterfall with your hands under your butt, and you're like, okay, well, this is where we're running, I guess. So that's kind of the bike. And then again, the run, I've alluded to it. It's a trail run. Again, some courses are tamer than others. So it just depends there. In terms of distances, there's kind of like two distances, and they ebb and flow based on trail networks and stuff. But ITU originally came out with a format that was 1K swim. It was 20 to 25K bike, and then it was meant to be like 7-ish K run. And that's the ITU side of it. So the International Triathlon Union. They very rarely have actually gone off that format. I think back in the first year that ITU did a off-road triathlon, it was that. And ever since, it's been 1,500 meters swim. The bike's been somewhere between 25 to 30K and a 10K trail run. And so that's what you see mainly in Xterra. And so if we say, well, what's the difference between ITU and Xterra? Xterra is a private brand that started it, and the ITU is the like governing body of triathlon around the world. So they're who organizes World Cups, WTS races, duathlon, aquathon, the long course multi-sport championships and things like that. Whereas the equivalent Xterra, the equivalent would be like Ironman. Xterra is the off-road triathlon, like how Ironman is long course, if that makes sense. And so let's see here. Let's go into, does everyone kind of get a good grasp of what cross triathlon is? I want to make sure if anyone is like, I don't get what you meant, let me know and we'll touch back on it. But so let's talk a little bit maybe about training for it. this is, again, up to debate, I would say. You know, some coaches are going to look at it differently than others. I'll speak to my experience as athlete and coach in this, because basically I coach very much to how I was an athlete. And I was fortunate to have some really great coaches and help along my journey to having success in Xterra. Um, I find that, you know, if you take normal road triathlon training, you've got a distribution scale of, you know, 60% of your race is going to be bike, and the other percentages are going to be, you know, the swim is the shortest sliver, and the run is then the next biggest piece. Um, where it comes to cross triathlon, um, if you're not good at riding technical, this number of duration spent on a bike can drastically balloon. So when I write programs for athletes and how I trained, I spent a lot of time working skill on the bike. And yes, swim is important. And in terms of the professional model, you can't win the race in the swim, but you really can lose it. And early in my Xterra career, I gave away a lot in my swim. Whereas in the later career of my racing, I kind of became a pretty dominant swimmer within Xterra, either leading out or being able to sit in the front group fairly comfortably. Um, and then the next big component is the bike. And so, well, where does the bike differ from road triathlon to cross triathlon? And I don't mean what surface you're riding on. I mean in terms of the distribution of training. And we take, uh, you know, sure, there's a skill in riding in TT bars for a long period of time, but it's not the same skill of being able to handle and maneuver your bike through challenging single track. And so, as a coach or athlete, you need to balance how much time you're going to spend working on the polished engine. And so we'll call that Zwift. We'll call that intervals on uninterrupted roads or climbs. And then we got to talk about the technical side of it. And so, you know, working on, you know, finding a small segment of trail that is either a loop with generally a nice little climb, maybe a flat bit with a nice little descent. I love doing kind of segments on that, because what you can do as the athlete is you can start riding stuff and finding where your comfort levels are. And the important bit is finding the flow. And a lot of people have heard this word get thrown around in mountain biking. And if you're developing mountain biking, like developing your skill, the word flow is like, I don't understand what you were talking about. I just get jarred around and it's terrible. And it's just that it's going to take time to rehearse skill. And so sometimes, you know, riding a continual segment instead of going on this big epic loop, you get a chance to realize, well, where did I lose speed and why did I lose speed? And maybe you're going to, you know, take your friend who's better at riding than you, come out and explain a few things. That will help. But ultimately doing and trying it. And so say if we've got a technical section that you just aren't at the ability level to ride yet, well, you're going to mark that as in the race or in your training. That's much my planned dismount. I'm very big on not having people think that, you know, a race is coming and you just got to become a completely different person. I'm more pro you guys in training develop your skills to get to a place that you feel comfortable, and then when you go to pre-ride that course, you didn't change just because you're doing a race. You're not, you know, all of a sudden a superhero technical god on the bike. You've got to mark these areas where you're like, you know what, I don't look confident or don't feel confident riding this. You're better off to dismount, because if you're feeling that in your pre-ride, Imagine how you're feeling it after you've just swam 1,500 meters and however long you were into the bike at 180 beats a minute. It's going to go a lot worse. So this is this balance point in your training of technical riding mixed with polished engine. Yes, you need both to excel, because you can be I've seen, living in Whistler, you see some very talented mountain bikers in the bike park, but you ask them to ride up the hill, they ain't making it. So there's a bit of a balance here, and that's what I've always found. Doing some of the mountain bike races in Whistler is that I'll race people who they're still okay at climbing, but they are a lot better at me than descending. But the thing is that I can put so much more time on them in the climb. As long as I can move down the trail in a safe rate at a decent clip, sure, maybe I gave them back 15 seconds over a 10-minute descent, but it's nothing in comparison to the 20 minutes I put on them in the, hour-long climb or 40-minute climb that it took to get there. So, a balance point of everything. And that's where, again, the planned dismount, because if on a technical feature you just crash and splats over everywhere, and you've got to get your bike and yard sailed and your gels are everywhere, which you'll need for fuel, you're just going to bleed time. Whereas if you just said, I'm going to dismount, I'm going to systematically run down because you've practiced it, that's a lot of a better way to go. So does that kind of make sense, the distribution? And it's a bit of a flow, and I work individually with each athlete to find what that is. Because again, I have some athletes that have ridden their mountain bikes for their whole life, and I can sit and say, yeah, we're going to spend a little bit more time on your engine, because that's, where time is going to be available, like low-hanging fruit. And on the other end, it's like, oh, well, you can't ride on a bridge because you feel very nervous. Well, we're going to spend some time getting more confident and comfortable, because great, you got all the power, but if you've got nowhere to go, it's almost like, think of the analogy of like trying to drive a Ferrari on an or F1 car on a rally car course, if you will, right? Like it's just not going to work. So great, you've got all this engine and power, but the rally car is going to beat you. Run, a very similar model there, but again, we all walk as, humans. And so generally I'd say, like, unless you feel really uncoordinated on your 2 feet, I would implement trail running, but I generally side with more polished running, because I generally, as a coach and as an athlete, I generally tried to keep my kilometers low. If you take a professional runner that's training for a marathon, a lot of them will be around, 100 to 120 mile weeks. And we're talking, these are pretty good, robust athletes that can run this kind of mileage. As my bigger running weeks, not in a non-run focused week, I would be around 60 to 70 kilometers. So not huge mileage. And again, this is back when it was my full-time job. So, I generally have athletes running 3 to 4 times a week, depending on how I feel their soft tissue can handle it. So I take a little bit into account, like, what's athlete history? Do they have a chronic, or a history of stress fracture? Well, I'm going to be a lot more careful with that athlete's run loading. So generally, I try to keep everything off pavement. Generally, I try to do a lot of workouts, especially this plays nice into Xterra with uphill, because that's another thing to talk about in cross triathlon, is that generally cross triathlon equals about what a hard 70.3 would be. So a half Ironman. That's about, when I've raced professional half Ironman people that did their first Xterra, they generally come to the finish line. And one, as a off-road person, you always loved when you beat them, because they, big name. A lot of people know all the Ironman people. When you beat them or whatever, and they come to the finish line, they'd be like, holy smokes, they're absolutely humbled with how hard it is, because we're talking about you're off pavement, so rolling resistance is higher, and you're dealing with elevation gains over short distances that kind of get looked over by a lot of road athletes, because they might look and think, oh, like whatever, like it's 1,000 meters of climbing over, or sorry, they don't look at what it's over, because they're just like, oh, 1,000 meters of climbing. Well, they do 1,000 meters of climbing over 90K. Well, now you're doing it over 30 or 25K. That feels a lot different. And so a lot of times people will get this crazy cramping. And Tim was telling me that I guess there was a Try BC, one of these webinars on strength training. So if anyone listened to that, that's great. And that is something to incorporate in your plan. Functional strength is a big part of off-road triathlon, because you are dealing with changing unpredictable movements at times with the mountain bike. On the trail run, you're having to move and contort your body around these tight whipping corners, and on undulating terrain, and having to lift yourself up. And like I said, that race in Brazil where it's like I'm sliding down a waterfall with my hands on my butt. Like sometimes you just get thrown stuff. And actually in that race too, when I was at the top of the climb, there was a bridge that you had to run over, and I literally put my foot and it broke through one of the wood pallets, and I just fell right onto my like chest. And I remember just like being on the ground, being like, why am I on the ground? I was running on a wooden bridge, but because I put a foot through a piece of wrought wood. Generally in Canada, we're not that, the courses aren't that loose. But yeah, so functional strength. So, and to clarify, when you're doing strength training, I generally say, have it be really about the strength. Avoid things like CrossFit, avoid things like circuit training. You're already doing enough cardiovascular work in your swim, bike, run. Have it be really about the strength. So, if you got a friend that really understands the gym, and, big, strong guy or girl that, is doing Olympic lifts and whatever, and they're willing to show you how to properly squat, properly do an RDL, reverse deadlift, trap bar. This is the kind of, we want to be throwing around that kind of weight. Slow movements, lower reps, but very strong, because you're going to get all the functional strength in your running and in your biking and swimming, that we want the strength training to be about building the strength, and core, if you will. And so I know I am kind of, all these have lots of tentacles and branches that we can branch off into and have deeper convos. So again, if something sparked an interest, put it in the chat. Excuse me, I'll get a drink of water. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the training. Say it again. Say it again one more time. Oh, might have just been a what do you call it? Non-muted. So we've talked a little bit about the training. Again, the swimming. I guess I didn't fully touch on that. Very similar to triathlon. Like, yes, you need to be able to swim. Yes, you should be able to get through the course. Do I think it's great to do stroke correction? Yes. Just be careful about, if you start getting someone in your ear telling you that you should be swimming 7 times a week, and that's what's going to make you a better swimmer. I'm not going to agree with it. Especially, again, if your goal is to show up to a master's swim meet and do well, then yes, that will work with some technique work. But in triathlon, do stroke correction, find someone that you like and trust, and listen to them. Don't get into, Joe at the pool told you that you need to, get your arms further apart. Pick your person, your trusting person, and tune everyone else out. When I've developed and worked on my stroke, I tuned out everyone but the coach that I work with. Sometimes you'd go to a race and some athlete would tell you something about your stroke and just in one ear, out the other. It's like a golfer, similar thing. They don't, when they work with their swing coach or whatever, they're not listening to anyone else. So with the swim, I generally think 2 to 3 times a week. Like, pools are hard to get to. You have to abide by their schedule. So generally 2 to 3 swims is great. Think about one being quality, one being maybe on the more aerobic end, like of just simple endurance, and one being very technical based. And so again, sometimes it's worth investing a few like stroke correction sessions. And anyone who's actually knows what they're talking about with stroke correction, they'll want to work with you for a period of time, and they'll want to then get you to swim on your own for a good chunk of time and then come back. Anyone that just wants to consistently work with you is just trying to drain your wallet, because you're not really, you got to get it for yourself and then come back to kind of what's sticking. Whereas consistent, like if someone's constantly hammering you, you don't ever really learn it as much for yourself, is my opinion. So in a master's program I run up here in Whistler, we generally I try to do a stroke correction day in our program once per month that everyone's a part of. And then it's like, okay, what happens over that month, see what stuck and see what slipped. Because I find you'll actually move forward in your stroke faster and whatnot. So yeah, that's training training for a cross triathlon. Did anyone have any question that came up through the training part of a triathlon? Just gonna see if anyone's typing. Doesn't look like it. Okay, look at me. I'm explaining things, I guess, crystal clear. Oh, all good. Yeah, great. I'm doing great. If something comes up, just yeah, keep it going with a question and whatnot. But so let's talk about maybe well, actually, yeah, let's talk about the transition part. I think this is something that I see a lot of, I guess, as a coach and as an athlete, on the professional end, it's very minimal. I think that's the thing. You confirm that my swim instructor said once a month. Perfect. Great. Glad to see that. When it comes to the transition, as a pro, I used to see a lot of new pros. And I think even myself in my first few triathlons, I would like want to take all this crap onto the bike that I didn't really need. And as I moved along in my pro career, I started to, and generally, I mean, you can look at results pages. I'm not trying to flex on anyone or anything, but I generally would have the fastest T1 and sometimes T2. I didn't spend a lot of time screwing around. I generally would look to, helmet on, gloves were already on my bars, so I'd put them on while riding. I don't recommend it unless you're very confident with riding no-handed and whatnot. And my shoes would already be attached to the bike. And again, I don't recommend it unless you had special shoes, which for a time I had a company that literally made me triathlon uppers with a mountain bike sole on the below. So if we take that pro part of it out of it, what are the things that we need and what are the things that we don't need? And so, do I think that having a camelback is good? Depends. Depends on how long you think you're going to be on the bike. All I say is make sure you're not dragging around liquid that you're not going to drink. It's heavy. And it's also heavy on your back. And, you think of as you're trying to ride and turn, you've got all this water that's going to be sloshing around. So all your stabilizing muscles are going to work that little bit harder. So I'm not saying I'm against camelbacks, but if you are going to use one, know why you're using it and know how many liters you're going to put in it. So to think about the supplementing, because yeah, I like the idea of, putting a straw in your mouth and then you can, drink and descend. Personally, I wasn't coordinated enough to drink and descend. I just always went with bottles in the bike. Some races will allow you to have an area where you can hand off to someone. They'll have a designated spot where you can get a new bottle. For hot climates, and Xterra World Champs used to always be in Hawaii. So I had a designated person for me that would hand me off bottles. And it's funny, the bigger the race, again, speaking to the professional end of it, where as a pro, getting to the finish line isn't the goal. It's earning money and position, and points. So a lot of times as an athlete, if your race isn't going well, a professional athlete and a good professional athlete will bow out of the race. I know this makes some amateurs upset because they think they see it as a disrespect to the race. And I can see the point of that. But the argument back, I'd say, on the pro is that you're doing it to earn an income. And if all of a sudden you're out of money or points to earn you money, you have no business being on that course anymore. And you need to stop, because it's get yourself prepared for the next opportunity to earn money and whatnot. So unless anyone's pro on this call, that applies to you. If you're not, then that doesn't apply to you. And it's generally you've spent a lot of money to be there and you want to get to the finish line. So let's talk about what you need on the bike. So you need stuff to change a flat. A lot of times as a pro, I would negate taking that stuff, because as the races got more competitive, flat tire, you're out of points and you're out of money. So why bother carrying the stuff? As an amateur, yes, carry a flat kit. And so generally now, like, everyone in mountain biking is running tubeless. So meaning they don't have an inner tube in. So a lot of people now are carrying CO2s, bacon strips that you can plug puncture wounds in. You're carrying, some people will just not have CO2s and have a hand pump. Some races that, where they're in super foreign countries, you might not be able to get a CO2, and generally TSA, if they can find them, they'll take them from you. I used to get pretty good at finding ways to hide them. Be like, I don't have any CO2s. Oh, that one up in the seat post? Well, I don't know how that got there. But so those kind of things are very beneficial to carry. Gloves, I always say gloves on the bike. There'll be the odd photo of me racing without gloves or one glove. Sometimes in my putting them on, I've dropped a glove before. That happened once. And another time, if I'm in a super dry climate, and again, I'm making a decision as a professional that I could save time, not worry about gloves. If it was dry enough, my hands wouldn't get slippery. But for the most part, I would always wear gloves. And what else do you need? You need nutrition. This is obviously similar to road triathlon. But what's hard about it is in terms of if anyone's done an Ironman or a road tri, just sitting along in your TT bars or in the drops or whatever, and you can eat whenever you want. Generally, aside from maybe the 4 turns that are on the course that you're going to be turning the bike and then back into your position, you can hit a schedule. You can set your little device to yell at you like, hey, it's 15 minutes, time to get some food in. It doesn't work that way in Xterra. You pre-ride the course and you're making mental notes of areas that are going to be planned dismounts. You're also making mental notes about where good opportunities to fuel are. And in my career, I made before this company, which I'll get to, existed, I made a awful drink, and I used to just call it rocket fuel. It was just this terrible mixture. Well, it wasn't terrible because it worked, but it was tough because it was like Gatorade powder, it was salt tabs, and it was gels, all mixed inside this super concentrated bottle. And the unfortunate thing is that was good, but it wasn't perfect because I would drink this thing. And yes, you'd have this huge delivery of glycogen to your system, which is what you want, fast burning fuel. But the thing is that I didn't have then enough water. Generally, you would have a few places where you would get a water, and that's when I would then, at the bottle handoff, grab a water bottle, drink as much of it as I could and huck it away, and then keep sipping on that drink. Generally, I sided with going with this method because I was done my race in usually around 2 hours to 2.5 hours. So by the time my stomach would just be in knots and I would feel terrible, I was at getting lunch at a Mexican restaurant or something where I'm like, oh my God, get me a Coca-Cola. My stomach feels like it's turning. If you're going to be out on the course longer and you're not going to do, a championship distance in 2 or 2.5 hours, thank goodness they created better products that now you don't have to worry about that. So later in my career, I started using a company called Morton's, which a lot of people are probably familiar with. I started getting to use them in 2016 when they were not what they are yet. They were just prototyping. And the stuff is amazing. It uses a hydrogel technology that basically allows your stomach to absorb the calories and carbs without that extra water intake needed, which officially I never used Morton's because, as many people know, I was a Cliff Bar sponsored athlete, and at the time of being with them, I wasn't allowed to talk about Morton's. But from 2017 onward, I was using it in my racing. It was in a Cliff Bar bottle, but it was Morton's. That's how good that stuff is. And it's a really complex product, but a very simple delivery mechanism. So I tell a lot of my athletes, like, test it, make sure it agrees with your gut, make sure you can deal with the taste. But it's so simple. They have packets that tell you how many calories you're getting. You can figure out with your coach and or find a coach and help you figure out what your nutrition plan needs to be based on your calorie expenditures through some of your harder sessions, and build out a plan. So that's something as well that you need to be focused on. So your nutrition starts pre-race, then you're doing your swim, you're not really getting an opportunity. First thing on the bike, you start intaking, and that then stays until the last little bit of the run. Basically, you'll stop your nutrition intake when you have about 15 minutes of racing left, because whatever you put in, it takes your body about 15 minutes to actually utilize it. So, generally, when it's you're running for either the cash, the glory, or the medals, or whatever you're chasing, you're packing away your nutrition plan with about 15 minutes to go, and you're looking to race the best that you can, and whatnot. So, what else do you want to bring on the bike? I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Gloves, shoes, yeah. So one question I get a lot, should you wear socks? And again, I go back to depends on individually, but if you're prone to blisters, 100% wear socks and wear them as soon as you can. If you're not prone to blisters, and you often will ride and run sockless, then I would say yes. I used to, as I got closer to races, I would run sockless purposefully for the idea of I would build up the callus areas where I could chafe. And I spent a number of years being sponsored with Nike, and so if they sent me a new shoe that they wanted me to be in for said race, I would train in that shoe, figure out, because every new shoe, all of a sudden, I would get a new little rub area. And sometimes if they send it to me really last minute, you figure out, okay, it's going to rub me here because I ran for 20 minutes and I could feel it forming. I would put that kinesiol or KT tape. Everyone's familiar with that stuff. a lot of debate over it, whether it works or not, but what it does work really well for is sticking on and staying on during the swim to cover when you go out to the run. So yes, that baby powder in your shoes, that's another great one. Especially in off-road tri, because you're going to get sections, like I said, I'm scooting down a waterfall. It's not like you're wet only once in the race. Like, you know how triathlon is, you're pouring water over yourself. Having that baby powder is helpful to just help along. If you put too much in, you'll just form these big clump balls that will form in your shoes, and then you got to feel like you're kind of stepping on marbles a bit. But yeah, baby powder is well good. So does anyone have sorry, I missed this. How do you use KT tape during the run? Yeah. So what I was saying about KT tape was just that I would use it as blister protection. If, you know, again, if you're electing to go sockless and, you know, you want to save that time, it's a way that you can protect known areas that are going to blister. Generally, I used to always get it when Nike came out with those 4% shoes. I chose to actually run those shoes in a lot of lighter Xterra run courses because the benefit of what those shoes did far outweighed maybe the lack of traction. But they used to give me this little cut right where the top of the back of the heel would meet my Achilles. So I used to always put a little piece of KT tape there, and that would solve that issue. Because by the time I'd be on second lap of the run, or, you know, from kilometer 5 to 10, I always say if there's something that in race mode, your brain is associating pain, you starting to have a real problem, because it will start to impact then what speed or what effort you're putting forward. So generally, like, you know, I could crash on the bike, not think about it at all, get to the finish line and realize, oh my God, look at all this like blood I had here. I had no idea. If you've got something that starts to make you be like, oh my God, as you're, you know, going, like, you know, you might have a problem with it and stuff. So that's KT tape. And again, Xterra, you might be running through creek beds, passing little bits of puddles or whatever that, you know, that can happen in road tri too, but there's going to be mud and grit that you're not normally going to get in road tri. So again, good to build up some foot toughness is what we'd like to call it. So in the summer, you know, walk around your house and or well, around the outside of your house in bare feet. Obviously, make sure you're not going to walk over a bunch of shards of glass or whatever, but toughening up your feet makes a big difference in triathlon. And actually, you know, if we're expanding to foot, we can talk a little bit about foot safety. We actually in the national team spent a lot of time talking about this, that in one way you've got to toughen your feet up, but in the other end of it, you have to be so careful about any cut or any abrasion, blister that you get on your foot. You need to be very mindful about it can become a life-threatening issue if you get the wrong infection in there. And you don't want to lose your foot over triathlon. So take care of your feet in one column, toughen them up systematically, but keep an eye on them and keep your blisters clean and whatnot. Especially again in Xterra, you know, I've heard about athletes that had to take considerable time off because you ran through a cow field and you had a blister. You didn't bother going to the medical aid, getting it properly cleaned out after the race, and they got a nasty infection from cow crap. And or maybe some people would know Conrad Stoltz, who is like kind of the generation prior to me of pro racing. We only overlapped for a year or two of my professional racing, but he kicked a piece of rebarb in in a river in the Xterra in Richmond, Virginia. And he ended up racing the rest of the race. He probably shouldn't have, because he needed a bunch of stitches. I think he even messed up some of his tendons. You can easily see that was the beginning of the end of his career, because he never really ran the same after it. He never could do the same run volume. And shortly after that, he ended up retiring. It wasn't necessarily all because of that, but there was a lot of races where I remember he was leading the bike in Alabama, which is the race after Richmond, and he didn't even go out onto the run course because his foot was so messed up from this rebarb incident with the infection. Anyways, I'm rambling about feet, so we'll move on. Any questions that were sparked? And I don't know about you, Tim, but do you think we could open some Q&A?
Absolutely. I think that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for sharing kind of your story of dealing with the heart surgery, and that's a wild roller coaster for sure the past couple years. And fantastic tips and notes for training and racing. I really like the polished intervals and technical training balance for mountain biking. That's definitely one of the big differences. And
Yeah,
the
actually,
KT tape.
I'll speak to one thing just about that where I think I didn't get my full point. You can still do intervals with that mountain biking flow state. And when I say, find a climb, find a descent, what I would do a lot for training for Xterra would be I would do my interval up a technical climb trail where I have to balance power output and technical riding. So I could, if I did a number of intervals, your interval is more of a range. So sometimes I'll say to an athlete, your range is find a climb that's going to be 6 to 8 minutes. And what you get to do then is you start to take note of when you reach the top of the climb. So did more effort and a higher heart rate and or power wattage output get you a faster time? Or do you try to hold back your effort a bit, but ride cleaner and not bobble on as much stuff? And does that net you a better climb? As you do that workout, you start to find where you're like trail speed at races. So that's my finish point to that.